Conceived as the most stable democracy in the Middle East, the Lebanese Republic enjoyed the privileges of a French soft colonialism rule and a political system based on the representation of all its minorities. On the basis of confessionalism, political powers were divided into different sects according to the 1926 constitution, giving equal powers to the main sects: Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, Druze, and Shia Muslims, together with a de facto control of the government by the neighboring Syrian Arab Republic. Due to the Palestinian migration after the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1940s, which easily forged alliances with the Shia Muslim inhabitants, the Maronite population started riots that escalated to the triggering of the Civil War. As one of the main disputes in the Middle East, the Lebanese Civil War illustrated the international tensions between the State of Israel and the Muslim neighboring regimes. Between 1975 and 1990, Lebanese armed militias gathered the support of the international community to trigger a war that would leave Lebanon completely destroyed. On one side, the Lebanese Front and the former Army of the Free Lebanon, later known as South Lebanese Army, mainly composed by Maronite Christian soldiers, gathered the support of the Israeli armed forces. On the other side, the former Lebanese National Movement, succeeded by the Lebanese National Resistance Fronts, and the Shia communities under the rule of the Amal Movement and Hezbollah, joined the Palestinian cause under the flag of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In addition, the Lebanese armed forces, representing the Lebanese government, work in cooperation with the UN, several Arab states, mainly Syria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Libya, and Yemen, and Western armies, mainly the United States, France, and Italy. Despite the complexity of actors in the three different fronts, the Lebanese Civil War was mainly a dispute between the Maronite Christian sects with the support of Israel against the Shia Muslim sects defending the Palestinian forces. The war is usually divided into four different phases. First of all, the initial phase of the war took place between 1975 and 1977, when Lebanon was mostly controlled by Palestine and Syria, and the remaining regions were under the control of the Maronite Christian groups. During this period, the main tensions between Palestinians and Christians triggered massacres and retaliation strikes until the Syrian intervention and the division of Beirut. The second phase was developed between 1977 and 1982, when the South Lebanon became the main scenario. After the involvement of Israel, the United Nations passed Resolution 425 to create the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, still operating nowadays. In addition, the Syrian role in Beirut was becoming stronger, acting as a de facto governmental power. The third phase took place between 1982 and 1983 and was initiated by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. After a siege and failed United Nations Security Council resolutions, Beirut fell, and the PLO and Syrian forces were obliged to abandon the capital after a United States-led multinational intervention under the UN flag. It's not until the end of this third period and during the last stage of war, from 1984 through 1990, that negotiation processes and peace agreements start to take place. Nonetheless, the armed conflict does not seem to disappear and violence escalates even after the adoption of peace agreements. One can highlight that the conflict ended up as a total disintegration of the state, civil war, sectarian-based killings, and a space where foreign states carry out their power struggle through proxy of local militias, finding a solution that could finish violence but not reconstruct the state. Starting on the very early stages of the conflict, when all violent events had not escalated into an international affair, several parties attempted to reach agreement and start negotiation processes to avoid a war. The first big agreement was developed in May 1983, known as the 17 May Agreement, which joined the efforts of the United States, Israel, and Lebanon. After 8 years of civil war, including the siege of Beirut and the assassination of the Lebanese president Bashir Gemayel, parties seemed to agree on the peaceful resolution of the conflict. The three parties agreed on the inviolability of the Lebanese-Israeli boundaries, the establishment of a security region in South Lebanon, and the end of the hostilities and the withdrawal of troops from certain areas. Nonetheless, despite all the efforts of the diplomats William Draper from the US, David Kimch for Israel, and Antoine Fatal from Lebanon, the 17 May Agreement never succeeded. 1 year after, in 1984, the Confessional government collapsed in Beirut, and the tensions between Lebanon and Israel increased again. Despite the will of the three parties to put an end to the ongoing war scenario, it was external pressure received which made negotiations fail, not because of the lack of agreement, but because of the dissolution of the Lebanese government for the next year. However, seeing the possibility of a peace agreement after the success of the Camp David Accords, the three main Lebanese factions attempted to reach a deal to avoid a re-escalation of violence. The Amal movement, presided by the current Speaker of the Parliament, Nabi Berri, the Druze Progressive Socialist Party, led by Walid Jumblat, and the Christian Lebanese Force under the control of the commander Eli Hobeika, met together to draft the tripartite accord in 19 1985. Nevertheless, once again, the inherent legal backgrounds of the accord and the different tensions between the three parties created misunderstandings that would break the peace negotiation. In this case, it was not as much as the external pressure, but the unwillingness and inability of all the parties to reach the proposed goals. External pressure received by other parties involved in the Civil War, as well as the rapid change of ideas alliances, did not allow the agreement of the truthful outcome to end the armed conflict. Despite the willingness of most of the Lebanese sectarian groups to get rid of violence, failed agreements and the lack of action by the UN did not seem to put an end to the war without a single winner with the control of the whole Lebanese territory. While Israel acted as a support of the Maronite Christian population to gain the control of the country, the Shia community saw Israeli intervention as a violation of the Aran sovereign territories and therefore formed armed resistance. With the Syrian army showing its strength and the PLO unwilling to abandon the Lebanese territories, direct attack of Israel and the strong rule of Hezbollah militias in the south of the country, war escalated again. In order to put an end to the ongoing conflict, the highest representatives of all parties gathered together with international community spokespersons in Taif, Saudi Arabia, in 1989. Together they drafted the Taif Agreement, which entered into force in 1990, and was focused in two main axes. The first deals with the internal reforms including power sharing, participation, identity, political and socio-economic reform, sovereignty and internal security. The second is devoted to external relations, relating to the Arab-Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Lebanese-Syrian relations. All the members of the Arab League, especially Saudi Arabia and Syria, as well as the United States, under the supervision of the UN, participated in the creation of the agreement to close the dispute. The first point of the agreement was to solve the internal dispute by amending the Lebanese constitution, adding general principles as a preamble and a constitutional articles about power sharing. As part of this innovative solution, the parties established a division of power between the main sectarian groups of the population, and the new National Pact re-established the powers of the main political leaders. Several functions of the President of the Republic, always a Maronite Christian, were transferred to a Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers was presided by the Prime Minister, always Sunni Muslim, and the Prime Minister was accountable to the Parliament and its President, always Shia Muslim. Lebanon increased the number of parliamentary seats from 99 to 128 and was divided in a 50-50 Christian-Muslim ratio represented to avoid the pre-war sectarian system. Despite Taif did not put an end to the sectarian rule in Lebanon, it allowed to further division of powers between the established TROIKA, the President of the Republic, the Prime Minister, and the President of the Parliament, and the different sects they represented, which could be understood as a first step towards a dismantlement of confessionalism. Political openness after the agreement meant a political change, removing all the warlords that held power during the war to welcome an elite of newcomers, like the former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. Nonetheless, Lebanon's post-Taif leadership has been more concerned with assuring its own divergent interests within the state institutions than taking up the reformist spirit of the agreement, making corruption increase with the government. In addition, the agreement seemed to have the three main flaws that didn't allow the country to reconstruct in the positive way. First of all, the text was ambiguous and created legal vacuums on crucial parts, like Lebanon's relations with neighboring countries like Israel and Syria. In addition, the first step towards dismantlement of the confessional state was done, but there weren't further steps to completely get rid of the system. Second, the confessional troika never acted as a consensus system to provide checks and balances to the different sects, but rather as a closed group that held all decision-making power, with the entire control of the three branches of government. With the judicial system under the political control, the military holding too much power, and the lack of accountability of the executive and legislative personnel, there was never an attempt to establish a fair system with respect to the rule of law. Last but not least, one could claim that Taif put an end to the violence and the 15-year civil war, but completely turned a blind eye on any attempt of foster transnational justice processes. Despite Taif should have been a reconciliation process, it ended up as an inclusion of warlords into the political system, a destabilization of the country, and a complete lack of infrastructure and social policies. Unfortunately, the conflict was never solved in a fruitful agreement, letting all wounds to be open again, and the tensions between the southern Lebanese militias under the Shia rule and the Israeli forces was extremely fragile. As Taif did not emphasize the need of peaceful relations with the Jewish state and the lack of transitional justice never calmed radical militias, it was a matter of time that the conflict escalated again. The lack of a Lebanese-Israeli peaceful relation and the power that the radicalized Shia militias, mainly under the control of the Amal movement and Hezbollah, were gaining, caused a reopening of the old war. Known as Harf Tammuz or the July War, the conflict that took part between the State of Israel and the Lebanese Hezbollah started on July 12, 2006, when the Lebanese Hezbollah crossed the border into Israel and kidnapped 2 soldiers, triggering a war that lasted for a month. During the conflict, the United settled up to 19 ceasefires in order to stop the ongoing conflict, the calm situation, being aware that a similar scenario to the one on the Civil War could appear again. Israel and Hezbollah never reached an understanding about the war, and both parties claimed the victory of the conflict for their own. Despite Lebanon was way more affected than Israeli attacks, which included the destruction of the main infrastructure of the country, Israel was also severely damaged. In any case, none of the parties seemed to have a collaboration strategy to put an end to the conflict, and the UN had to act as a third party to impose a ceasefire under the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 and the strengthening of UNIFIL in South Lebanon. More than 2 decades after Taif, many major political reforms are yet to be implemented, including related to electoral law, to decentralization, and to the plan to gradually abolish sectarianism. This system established in Taif led to a destabilization of the already fragile constitutional institutions, which was translated into a severe polarization of the political arena. That same year, Paris tried once again to embrace negotiation processes with the Doha Agreement on the results of the Lebanese National Dialogue Conference in Qatar. The agreement was based on 5 main pillars. First of all, the appointment of a General Michel Suleiman as elected president by consensus within 24 hours, taking into account the exceptional circumstances. Second, the formation of a national unity government composed of 30 ministers distributed among the majority, 16 ministers, the opposition, 11 ministers, and the president, 3 ministers, with inability to obstruct or resign. Third, an electoral law reform in order to reshape the electoral constituencies and districts both in Lebanon and Beirut. Fourth, the prohibition of the use of weapons and violence by all political parties as a method of electoral gain, as well as the will to initiate dialogue to promote the Lebanese state's authority over all Lebanese citizens. And last in sequence but not in relevance, reasserting the commitment of the Lebanese political leaders to immediately abstain from resorting to the rhetoric to treason or political or sectarian instigation. With the Syrian withdrawal after Hariri's assassination in 2005, both UNIFIL and UNRWA handling the situation of Israel and Palestinian population in Lebanese territory, and the strong role of the TROIKA and even Hezbollah as a political party, the fragile peace seemed to be back at Lebanon. Furthermore, the lack of political consensus has been translated into a lack of educational and social policies to the whole population. Instead of developing a plan to heal the wound of war, the Taif Agreement did not provide an official version of the development of the armed conflicts, increasing historical vacuum of 15 years that each sect has filled according to its own interpretation. The selective teaching of history can be a powerful political tool, but controversially, a shared narrative about the past might help to bring down the barriers that continue to divide the population, and Lebanon never found that narrative. Neither Taif nor Doha were able to establish a dialogue about war, and still nowadays it is impossible to find a narrative of the events between the 1970s and the 1990s. Lebanon has been unable to maintain the stability by its own, and the Troika, rather than acting as a mechanism for managing conflict, has rather led to the personalization of power and to breaking among the 3 components. What Taif conceived as an improvement towards a checks and balance system has ended up as a constant veto situation, the appropriation of public institutions acting as private sectarian preserves, and the confronting factions within the government itself. In addition, Doha brought the political stability to the country but did not last long. Unwillingness to solve disputes by all parties have made the conflict resolution an improbable scenario, and the lack of dialogue about the war makes divergent sects to establish divergent narratives about the war. Despite both Taif and Doha seem to be a good resolution for the armed conflicts and settle the basis of a path of reconstruction, reality shows how sectarian system remains inherent to Lebanese politics. Agreement that seemed to be a good short-term solution to fix the governmental problems ended up generating long-term crises due to the lack of negotiation and consensus between the Lebanese confessional sects.